Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from the American Midwest. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the autumn of 1963, workers demolishing an abandoned farmhouse in rural Indiana made a discovery that would haunt the small community of Millfield County for decades to come. Behind a false wall in what had once been the root cellar, they found a wooden crate containing items that defied explanation. Among moth-eaten fabrics and yellowed papers was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with the meticulous handwriting of a woman named Margaret Thorne. The final entry, dated December 15, 1933, ended abruptly with the words, "I can hold this no longer. God forgive me for what I have done and what I have allowed to continue." The discovery prompted a quiet investigation by local authorities, though the case was quickly archived and forgotten. The official report, filed away in the basement of the county courthouse, contained only sparse details. What it did not contain were the testimonies of those who had known the Thorne family during their final months in Millfield County, testimonies that painted a picture far more disturbing than any official document could capture. The workers who made the initial discovery reported that the crate had been sealed with wax and wrapped in oiled cloth, suggesting deliberate preservation rather than hasty concealment. More unsettling was the discovery that the false wall itself had been constructed with considerable skill, indicating planning and preparation that extended far beyond desperate improvisation. Margaret Thorne had been 42 years old in 1933, the wife of a traveling salesman named Robert Thorne. They had moved to the isolated farmhouse on Hickory Ridge Road in the spring of that year, seeking cheaper living during the harsh economic times that had gripped the nation. The house sat 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by dense woodland that seemed to swallow sound and light equally. The property had been vacant for 2 years prior to their arrival, following the death of its previous owner, an elderly bachelor named Samuel Hutchins, who had lived there in complete solitude for over 30 years. Local residents described Margaret as a quiet woman with nervous hands and eyes that never quite met yours when she spoke. Her voice carried a peculiar quality that several neighbors noted. She spoke as though constantly listening for sounds that others could not hear. Robert Thorne was remembered differently by those who encountered him during his brief stays at home. A tall man with graying temples and a voice that carried too easily in the silence of the countryside, he claimed to sell farming equipment throughout the tri-state area. His absences grew longer as 1933 progressed, sometimes lasting weeks at a time. When pressed by neighbors about his extended trips, Margaret would offer vague explanations about distant territories and difficult economic conditions, though her voice would grow thinner with each excuse. The local postmaster, Edwin Fletcher, noted that Robert's mail consisted primarily of correspondence from cities that seemed to follow no logical pattern for a traveling salesman's route. Letters arrived from remote towns in Kentucky, isolated communities in Ohio, and farming settlements in Illinois that appeared to have no connection to agricultural equipment sales. The first unusual incident occurred in late July of that year. Mrs. Helena Kowalski, who lived closest to the Thorne property along the county road that connected Millfield to the neighboring township of Cedar Falls, reported hearing what she described as rhythmic hammering coming from the direction of their farmhouse. The sounds began after midnight and continued through the night and into the early morning hours, following a pattern that suggested systematic work rather than casual repair. When she inquired about possible construction projects during a chance encounter at Morrison's General Store, Margaret claimed ignorance of any such sounds. The hammering continued sporadically throughout August, always during the darkest hours, always seeming to emanate from somewhere beneath the main house. Mrs. Kowalski's husband, Joseph, attempted to investigate the sounds on one occasion, walking the 1.5 miles from their property to the Thorne farmhouse during one particularly intense session of nocturnal hammering. However, as he approached the property line, the sounds ceased completely, leaving only the oppressive silence that seemed to characterize the area around the Thorne house. September brought an early frost to Millfield County, and with it, a change in Margaret's behavior that concerned the few neighbors who maintained contact with her. Where she had once appeared nervous but conversational during trips to town, she now moved with mechanical precision, completing her errands in silence before retreating to the isolation of Hickory Ridge Road. Her transformation was particularly notable to Martha Stevens, who operated the small lending library housed in the basement of the Methodist Church. Margaret had been a regular borrower of books, showing particular interest in historical accounts and biographical works. However, beginning in early September, her reading preferences shifted dramatically toward technical manuals and reference works dealing with preservation methods, documentation techniques, and record-keeping systems. When Mrs. Stevens commented on this change, Margaret's only explanation was that she had developed an interest in maintaining things properly for future reference. The local postmaster noted that she had stopped collecting mail entirely, despite regular deliveries continuing to arrive addressed to both Margaret and Robert Thorne. The accumulation of uncollected mail became so significant that Fletcher was forced to hold items at the post office rather than continuing to stuff them into the roadside mailbox. Among the held mail were several packages that arrived without return addresses, packages that felt unusually heavy and seemed to contain irregularly shaped objects. Fletcher's attempts to contact Margaret about these packages were unsuccessful, as she ceased visiting the post office entirely after the first week of September. More puzzling were the letters that continued to arrive addressed to Robert, letters that seemed to come from individuals rather than businesses. These personal correspondences often bore postmarks from the same remote locations that had characterized Robert's earlier mail, but the handwriting on the envelopes suggested distress or urgency that was inconsistent with routine business communications. It was during this period that 17-year-old Thomas Chen, who worked part-time delivering groceries for Morrison's General Store, reported what would later become one of the most unsettling testimonies in the informal investigation that followed decades later. On September 23rd, while making a routine delivery to the Thorne farmhouse, Thomas observed Margaret standing motionless in the front yard, facing the tree line that bordered her property. In her arms, she cradled what appeared to be a bundle of dark fabric. The positioning of her body suggested she had been standing in that exact spot for an extended period, as frost had formed on her shoulders and in her hair, despite the relatively mild afternoon temperature. When Thomas called out to announce his arrival, Margaret did not respond or acknowledge his presence in any way, continuing to stare fixedly at a point in the woods that showed no visible distinction from the surrounding forest. Thomas approached cautiously, setting the grocery order on the front porch as he had been instructed during previous deliveries. As he turned to leave, Margaret finally moved, rotating slowly to face him with movements that seemed unnaturally deliberate, as though each motion required conscious decision. The bundle in her arms, which he had initially mistaken for laundry or blankets, revealed itself to be something else entirely. Though Thomas struggled for years to articulate exactly what he had seen, he consistently described a collection of objects wrapped in what appeared to be a man's clothing, objects that seemed to possess an unnatural weight that caused Margaret's arms to tremble with the effort of holding them. The fabric wrapping was dark with moisture despite the dry weather, and seemed to have been tied with cord that had been knotted and re-knotted multiple times, creating a complex system of bindings that suggested both security and concealment. The most disturbing detail of Thomas's account concerned Margaret's expression during this encounter. Rather than embarrassment at being observed in such an odd state, Her face displayed what he described as profound relief, as though she had been waiting for someone, anyone, to witness what she carried. Her eyes, which neighbors had previously described as evasive, now held a directness that was almost aggressive in its intensity. When Thomas asked if she needed assistance, Margaret's only response was to shake her head slowly while continuing to stare directly at him, never looking down at the burden in her arms. The silence that followed this exchange extended for several minutes, during which Margaret remained motionless, while Thomas stood frozen by an inexplicable sense that speaking or moving might trigger some catastrophic response. Thomas completed his delivery and left the property with unusual haste, though he could not explain the source of his discomfort beyond the weight of Margaret's unwavering gaze and the disturbing realization that what he had witnessed was not a moment of accidental observation, but a deliberately staged presentation. October passed without significant incident, though several residents noted that no mail had been collected from the Thorne mailbox for over 6 weeks. The rural mail carrier, Edwin Fletcher, reported leaving notices about unclaimed parcels, but these too went uncollected. More concerning was the absence of any signs of activity around the property during daylight hours. No smoke rose from the chimney despite increasingly cold temperatures. No lights appeared in the windows after dark, and no movement could be detected around the house or outbuildings, even by neighbors who made deliberate efforts to observe the property from the main road. The Kowalskis, whose property provided the best vantage point for monitoring the Thorne farmhouse, reported that the building appeared to be completely abandoned during October, with no signs of human presence visible from their observation point. However, this apparent abandonment was contradicted by evidence of ongoing activity that became apparent only through careful observation over extended periods. The isolation of the Thorne farmhouse during this period was made more complete by the onset of an unusually harsh winter. Snow began falling in early November and continued with such consistency that Hickory Ridge Road became impassable to all but the most determined travelers. For nearly 6 weeks, the Thorne property existed in complete isolation, cut off from the outside world by weather that seemed to conspire with the family's increasing withdrawal from their community. It was during this period of forced solitude that neighbors later theorized the most significant events occurred, though definitive evidence of what transpired during those weeks was never established. The snowfall that isolated the property also revealed disturbing patterns of activity that had previously gone unnoticed. Tracks in the snow around the farmhouse suggested regular movement between the main building and various points in the surrounding woods, movement that occurred primarily during nighttime hours, when such activity would be invisible to distant observers. The first clear indication that something had fundamentally changed at the Thorne property came on December 20th, when a brief thaw allowed Edwin Fletcher to resume his mail route to Hickory Ridge Road. Approaching the farmhouse, he immediately noticed that the mailbox, which had remained untouched for months, was empty. Investigation revealed that someone had not only collected the accumulated mail but had done so selectively, taking only certain items while leaving others scattered on the ground beneath the mailbox. More unsettling was the discovery that someone had carved a message into the wooden post that supported the mailbox. In crude letters that appeared to have been cut with a dull knife, the words, "Forgive me," were visible, though weather and time had already begun to obscure the desperate carving. The carving itself showed signs of having been worked and reworked multiple times, with some letters cut deeper than others, and evidence of false starts where the carver had begun letters only to scratch them out and begin again. Fletcher's decision to investigate further led to the discovery of Margaret Thorne's final public appearance, though appearance may be an inadequate term for what he encountered. Finding the front door of the farmhouse standing open despite the bitter cold, Fletcher called out several times before stepping onto the covered porch. The interior of the house visible through the open doorway, appeared to have been systematically dismantled, with furniture moved aside and personal belongings arranged in careful stacks along the walls. Margaret emerged from the shadowed interior of the house, moving with the same mechanical precision that Thomas Chen had observed months earlier. However, her physical condition had deteriorated dramatically during the weeks of isolation. Her clothes hung loose on a frame that seemed to have diminished significantly, and her hair, which had once been carefully maintained, now hung in tangled strands around a face that appeared to have aged years in a matter of months. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that suggested prolonged exposure to cold, and her movements displayed a tremor that seemed to originate from deep within her body. Most disturbing was what Margaret carried during this final encounter. Rather than the mysterious bundle that Thomas Chen had observed, she now held a single object, a small wooden box roughly the size and shape of a jewelry case, though its surface had been extensively carved with symbols that defied recognition. The box appeared to have been crafted from dark wood that had been polished to an almost mirror-like finish, and its lid was secured with a small brass latch that showed signs of repeated opening and closing. When Fletcher inquired about the box, Margaret explained that it contained everything that matters, though she refused to elaborate on this cryptic statement. Her behavior during this encounter suggested a woman who had reached a decision of enormous significance, though the nature of that decision remained unclear to Fletcher during their brief interaction. Fletcher later testified that Margaret offered the box to him without speaking, extending it toward him with both hands as though presenting a gift of great significance. When he declined to accept it, Margaret's expression changed from hopeful expectation to profound disappointment, though she continued to hold the box throughout their brief interaction. Fletcher inquired about her husband's whereabouts and about her general welfare, receiving only vague responses that she delivered while staring at the wooden box in her hands. When pressed for more specific information about her circumstances, Margaret's final words were delivered in a voice so quiet that Fletcher had to lean closer to hear, "I kept it safe. I kept everything safe. But safe things sometimes need to be shared. He said they would understand when the time came, but the time keeps changing, and I cannot tell what he means anymore." Fletcher left the property with growing concern about Margaret's mental state and her ability to survive the continuing harsh weather in apparent isolation. His intention to report his concerns to local authorities was delayed by the resumption of heavy snowfall, which once again made Hickory Ridge Road impassable. When conditions finally improved enough to allow official investigation, the delay proved to have been crucial in ways that no one could have anticipated. The period between Fletcher's visit and the official response created a gap in the timeline that would later prove impossible to reconstruct, a gap during which the most significant events of the entire case appeared to have occurred. Sheriff Claude Morrison and Deputy William Hayes reached the Thorne property on January 8, 1934, responding to Fletcher's report of potential welfare concerns. What they discovered challenged their understanding of the case they believed they were investigating. The farmhouse stood exactly as Fletcher had described it, with the front door remaining open to the elements despite weeks of bitter cold. However, Margaret Thorne was nowhere to be found within the house or on the surrounding property. A systematic search of every room and outbuilding revealed no trace of recent habitation, as though the house had been abandoned for months rather than days. The absence of footprints in the snow around the house suggested that no one had entered or left the property since the most recent snowfall, which had occurred 3 days prior to the official investigation. This created a puzzle regarding Margaret's whereabouts that would never be satisfactorily resolved. The condition of the interior provided the first concrete evidence of the events that had transpired during the Thorne family's final months in Millfield County. The main floor of the house appeared to have been stripped systematically of personal belongings, with only the heaviest furniture remaining in place. However, Careful examination revealed that the removal had not been random. Every item that could conceivably be associated with Robert Thorne had been eliminated from the house, including clothing, personal papers, and even photographs that might have included his image. The thoroughness of this elimination suggested months of careful, methodical work. Drawers had been emptied and their contents sorted into piles that seemed to follow some organizational system that remained incomprehensible to the investigating officers. Books had been separated from other belongings and arranged alphabetically along one wall, while tools and household implements had been grouped according to function and stored in carefully labeled containers. More puzzling was the discovery of numerous small holes that had been drilled into the wooden floors and walls throughout the house. These holes varied in diameter from that of a pencil to that of a man's thumb, and appeared to follow no discernible pattern. Some holes had been carefully plugged with wooden dowels, while others remained open, creating an unsettling acoustic effect when wind passed through the house. Deputy Hayes noted in his report that the holes seemed to be concentrated in areas where conversations might typically take place: near chairs in the sitting room, around the kitchen table, and in the corners of bedrooms. The precision of the drilling suggested the use of proper tools and considerable skill, indicating that the holes had been created deliberately rather than as a result of damage or decay. Most disturbing was the discovery that several of the holes contained small objects, rolled papers, metal fragments, and items that appeared to be personal belongings that had been carefully concealed within the walls and floors. The basement of the farmhouse provided the most disturbing evidence of the activities that had occupied Margaret during her months of isolation. The space beneath the house had been extensively modified, with new wooden partitions creating several small chambers where none had existed during the property's previous ownership. Each chamber contained evidence of recent use, though the purpose of this use remained unclear to the investigating officers. Wooden shelves lined the walls of each chamber, and these shelves bore the marks of objects that had been stored there for extended periods. However, whatever had been stored had been removed with the same methodical thoroughness that characterized the rest of the house. The chambers showed signs of having been used for activities that required both privacy and systematic organization, though the specific nature of these activities could only be guessed from the physical evidence that remained. Most unsettling was the discovery of what appeared to be a workshop area in the largest basement chamber. Here, investigators found evidence of the woodworking activities that had produced the rhythmic hammering sounds reported by neighbors months earlier. Wood shavings and sawdust covered the floor, and several hand tools remained scattered across a makeshift workbench. However, no completed projects or work in progress could be found, suggesting that whatever Margaret had been creating during those long nights had been removed along with everything else. The tools themselves showed signs of having been used extensively, and the wear patterns suggested work that involved both construction and careful detail work. Marks on the workbench indicated that projects of various sizes had been completed in this space, though the absence of any finished pieces left the investigators to speculate about the nature of Margaret's nocturnal activities. The single exception to the comprehensive elimination of evidence was found behind the false wall that would not be discovered until the house's demolition 30 years later. Hidden within that sealed space was Margaret's journal, along with items that provided context for her written words. The preservation of these materials suggested that Margaret had intended them to be found eventually, though she had taken care to ensure that they would not be discovered during any casual investigation. The false wall itself had been constructed with considerable skill, using techniques that suggested familiarity with carpentry and construction methods. The space behind the wall had been lined with materials designed to protect its contents from moisture and decay, indicating long-term planning for preservation. The journal entries, when finally examined by investigators in 1963, revealed a woman struggling with knowledge that she felt unable to share, but equally unable to bear alone. The earliest entries, beginning in May of 1933, described Margaret's growing unease about her husband's extended absences and his reluctance to provide specific details about his work. However, her concerns initially centered on financial matters and the practical challenges of maintaining the isolated farmhouse without regular support. It was not until mid-June that the journal began to reflect more serious concerns about Robert's behavior when he was present at home. Margaret wrote of discovering items among Robert's belongings that seemed inconsistent with his claimed profession as a farm equipment salesman. These items, which she described in careful detail, suggested activities that had nothing to do with legitimate commerce. More troubling were the conversations she overheard during Robert's rare telephone calls, conversations that referenced people and places in terms that suggested intimate familiarity, despite Robert's claims of conducting business only with strangers in distant territories. Margaret documented these conversations as completely as possible, noting not only the content but also Robert's demeanor and emotional state during each call. Her observations suggested that Robert was discussing matters of great personal importance with individuals who knew details about his life that should have been unknown to business associates. The tone of these conversations ranged from anxious to threatening, with Robert sometimes displaying anger that seemed disproportionate to any business matters that Margaret could understand. The July entries marked a significant shift in both Margaret's understanding of her situation and her emotional response to that understanding. She had discovered what she termed evidence of deception, hidden in the basement of the farmhouse, evidence that Robert had apparently been collecting and storing without her knowledge. The nature of this evidence was described only in the most general terms, but Margaret's growing horror at her discoveries was documented with painful clarity. Her writing during this period showed increasing sophistication in matters of investigation and documentation, suggesting that she had begun to educate herself about methods of gathering and preserving evidence. More disturbing than Robert's apparent deceptions was Margaret's gradual realization that she was not the only victim of whatever activities had been taking place. References to others who trusted him and voices I recognize but cannot place suggested that Robert's activities had affected multiple individuals, though Margaret's understanding of the scope remained incomplete. Her journal entries during this period reflected a woman trapped between ignorance and knowledge, unable to remain unaware, but equally unable to fully comprehend what she had uncovered. The psychological pressure of this position was evident in her increasingly erratic handwriting and her growing tendency to write entries that seemed to be addressed to an unknown reader rather than serving as personal records. Margaret appeared to be documenting her discoveries not only for her own understanding, but also as a record that might eventually be discovered by others who could take action that she felt unable to take herself. The August entries documented Margaret's first attempts to gather definitive proof of her growing suspicions. Working during Robert's absences, she conducted systematic searches of the basement chambers and the surrounding property, discovering evidence that confirmed her worst fears about her husband's activities. However, rather than seeking outside help or attempting to escape her situation, Margaret began what she described as the preservation of truth. This preservation involved carefully documenting and storing the evidence she had found, creating a comprehensive record that she hoped might eventually serve to expose Robert's activities. Her methods showed increasing sophistication as she learned to photograph items, create detailed written descriptions, and organize materials in ways that would be comprehensible to future investigators. Margaret's decision to become the keeper of evidence rather than seeking immediate justice reflected both the isolation of her situation and her fear of Robert's reaction to discovery. Her journal entries made clear that she believed Robert was capable of extreme violence when confronted, and that her own survival depended on maintaining the appearance of ignorance while secretly working to ensure that the truth would eventually emerge. This delicate balance between self-preservation and justice-seeking created enormous psychological pressure that was evident in every page of her increasingly erratic handwriting. The entries from this period also revealed Margaret's growing awareness that Robert's activities extended far beyond what she had initially suspected, involving a network of individuals and locations that spanned multiple states. September brought a new development that would ultimately determine the course of events for both Margaret and Robert. During one of Robert's extended absences, Margaret discovered that he had been monitoring her activities through a system of hidden observation points throughout the house. The small holes that investigators would later find in walls and floors were part of an elaborate surveillance network that allowed Robert to observe Margaret's behavior even when he was supposedly absent from the property. This discovery shattered Margaret's belief that she had been operating in secret, forcing her to confront the possibility that Robert was aware of her investigations and was allowing them to continue for reasons she could not understand. The sophistication of the surveillance system suggested planning that extended back to the earliest days of their residence at the farmhouse, indicating that Robert's deceptions were far more elaborate than Margaret had realized. The realization that she had been observed without her knowledge triggered what Margaret described as the unraveling of everything I believed about my situation. Rather than abandoning her documentation efforts, she began to use Robert's surveillance system against him, deliberately performing activities in locations where she knew he could observe them. These performances were designed to convince Robert that she had discovered only a portion of his secrets, while concealing the true extent of her knowledge and the evidence she had gathered. The psychological complexity of this strategy placed enormous demands on Margaret's emotional resources, requiring her to maintain multiple levels of deception while continuing her investigation and documentation work. Her journal entries during this period showed increasing signs of the strain involved in maintaining such elaborate pretenses. October entries revealed the psychological toll of this elaborate deception. Margaret wrote of feeling as though she was constantly performing for an invisible audience, never certain when Robert might be watching or what consequences might follow from a misstep in her performance. The isolation of the farmhouse, which had initially provided her with opportunities to investigate, now felt like a trap that prevented her from seeking help, while ensuring that any mistakes she made would be observed and potentially punished. Her writing during this period showed increasing paranoia and anxiety, though her commitment to documenting the truth remained unwavering. Margaret also began to suspect that Robert's absences were not as extensive as they appeared, and that he might be remaining in the area to observe her activities more closely than his supposed travel schedule would suggest. The November entries, written during the period when the property was isolated by heavy snow, documented Margaret's final preparations for what she had come to believe was an inevitable confrontation with Robert. However, rather than planning to confront him directly, she had decided to force him to reveal himself through a carefully orchestrated revelation of the evidence she had gathered. This revelation would take the form of a presentation that would leave Robert no choice but to acknowledge his activities, while simultaneously ensuring that the truth would be preserved regardless of what happened to Margaret herself. The complexity of this plan suggested that Margaret had developed considerable skill in psychological manipulation, using Robert's own surveillance system and her understanding of his personality to create a situation that would force him into the open. The final entries in December described Margaret's implementation of this plan. Robert had returned to the farmhouse on December 10th, apparently unaware that Margaret had discovered his surveillance system or the true extent of his activities. Over the following days, Margaret began to reveal her evidence, piece by piece, presenting it not as an accusation, but as a discovery that she claimed to find puzzling and concerning. Her journal documented Robert's increasing agitation as he realized that Margaret's discoveries were far too systematic and comprehensive to be accidental. The psychological pressure on both participants in this elaborate game became evident in Margaret's descriptions of their interactions, which took on an increasingly surreal quality as both individuals struggled to maintain pretenses that had become obviously transparent. The confrontation that Margaret had been orchestrating reached its climax on December 14th, when Robert finally acknowledged that he was aware of Margaret's investigation and demanded to know the extent of her knowledge. Rather than denying her activities, Margaret presented Robert with the full scope of her evidence, along with detailed documentation that she had prepared of his activities over the preceding months. Her final journal entry described Robert's reaction to this revelation as the face of a man seeing his true self reflected for the first time. The entry continued with Margaret's acknowledgement that the game they had been playing was over, and that both of them now had to decide how to proceed with full knowledge of each other's awareness and capabilities. What happened immediately following this confrontation remained unclear, as Margaret's journal ended with her expression of inability to continue holding her burden alone. However, the evidence found hidden behind the false wall suggested that the confrontation had resulted in Robert's immediate departure from the property, leaving Margaret alone with the evidence she had gathered and the knowledge of what that evidence represented. The manner of his departure suggested urgency rather than planning, as personal items that should have been important to him were left behind in his haste to leave the farmhouse. Margaret's response to finding herself alone after months of elaborate psychological warfare was not documented, as her journal ended before she could record her reaction to this unexpected resolution. The items found alongside Margaret's journal in 1963 provided context for her written words while raising additional questions about the final resolution of the Thorne case. Among these items were personal effects that appeared to belong to multiple individuals, carefully preserved and cataloged with dates and locations that suggested Robert's activities had been far more extensive than even Margaret had realized. The organization of these items showed Margaret's growing sophistication as an investigator, with each piece of evidence labeled and cross-referenced in a system that would have been comprehensible to professional investigators. Also present were photographs and documents that indicated Robert had been using multiple identities while conducting his activities, operating under at least 4 different names across 3 states. Most disturbing were the detailed maps that Margaret had created, showing locations where she believed Robert had conducted his activities. These maps covered a significant portion of the Midwest, with particular concentration in rural areas similar to Millfield County. Each marked location was accompanied by notes that suggested Margaret had attempted to research these areas independently, seeking confirmation of events that Robert's evidence implied had occurred. Her notes indicated varying degrees of success in these investigations, with some locations providing clear confirmation of suspicious activities, while others remaining ambiguous. The sophistication of these maps suggested that Margaret had developed considerable skill in research and investigation, using methods that were remarkably advanced for a woman working in isolation without formal training. The revelation that Margaret had been conducting her own investigation into Robert's activities across multiple states suggested that her understanding of the situation had been far more sophisticated than her public behavior had indicated. Rather than being a passive victim of Robert's deceptions, she had been actively working to understand the scope of his activities and to gather evidence that could eventually be used to seek justice for his victims. This evidence suggested a level of courage and determination that stood in stark contrast to the nervous, withdrawn woman that neighbors remembered. The transformation from victim to investigator represented a remarkable evolution that occurred entirely in secret, hidden from both her husband and the community that might have provided support if they had understood the true nature of her situation. The question of Margaret's ultimate fate remained unresolved even after the discovery of her journal and evidence in 1963. Despite extensive searches of the property and surrounding area, no trace of her was found, nor was any evidence discovered to indicate what had happened to her after Robert's departure. Local authorities theorized that she had simply left the area following the confrontation, possibly seeking refuge with relatives in other parts of the country. However, no records were ever found of Margaret Thorne's subsequent life or death, leaving her disappearance as one of the most troubling aspects of an already disturbing case. The thoroughness of her disappearance suggested either careful planning on her part or intervention by parties unknown to the official investigation. Equally puzzling was the fate of Robert Thorne, who seemed to have vanished completely following his departure from the farmhouse in December of 1933. Despite Margaret's detailed documentation of his multiple identities and the extensive evidence she had gathered of his activities, no subsequent records were found of anyone matching his description or using any of his known aliases. Investigators theorized that Margaret's revelation of the extent of her knowledge had prompted Robert to abandon all of his established identities and disappear entirely, possibly fleeing to remote areas where he could operate without the sophisticated documentation that Margaret had demonstrated was possible. The completeness of his disappearance suggested access to resources and methods that went beyond what a simple traveling salesman should have possessed. The broader implications of Margaret's evidence suggested that Robert's activities had affected numerous individuals across multiple states, yet no coordinated investigation was ever conducted to identify or contact potential victims. The official response to the discovery of the evidence was characterized by the same quiet efficiency that had marked the initial investigation in 1934. The materials were cataloged, filed, and forgotten. Local authorities expressed concerns about the resources that would be required for a comprehensive investigation, particularly given the age of the evidence and the likelihood that many potential witnesses would no longer be available. This official reluctance to pursue the implications of Margaret's discoveries was later criticized by academic researchers who argued that important opportunities for justice were lost due to administrative convenience. However, unofficial inquiries conducted by interested parties in the years following the discovery revealed that Margaret's maps and documentation had been remarkably accurate. Locations that she had marked as significant often corresponded to unsolved disappearances or unexplained incidents from the 1930s, suggesting that her independent investigation had successfully identified a pattern of activities that official authorities had failed to recognize. These discoveries prompted several academic researchers to petition for a formal reopening of the investigation, though such requests were consistently denied due to budget constraints and the advanced age of the evidence. The academic interest in the case was complicated by the destruction of physical evidence and official reluctance to provide access to remaining documentation. The farmhouse on Hickory Ridge Road was demolished in 1963, immediately following the discovery of the hidden evidence. Despite historical preservation, advocates' arguments that the structure represented an important piece of local history. Official justification for the demolition centered on safety concerns related to the building's deteriorating condition, though local residents suspected that authorities were eager to eliminate any remaining evidence of the disturbing events that had occurred there. The demolition was conducted with unusual thoroughness, with even the foundation being removed and the basement filled with concrete. The speed and completeness of this destruction suggested official anxiety about the possibility of further discoveries that might complicate the desire to close the case permanently. The property itself remained undeveloped for decades following the demolition, despite its desirable location and the general pressure for development in Millfield County. Local real estate agents reported consistent difficulty in marketing the land, though potential buyers' reluctance was typically attributed to practical concerns about the remote location rather than awareness of the property's history. The few attempts to develop the land were abandoned after construction workers reported equipment failures and other difficulties that made development costs prohibitive. These practical problems may have reflected the thoroughness of the site's destruction, as the removal of the foundation and filling of the basement had created soil conditions that were unsuitable for new construction without extensive remediation. In the years immediately following the discovery of Margaret's evidence, several local residents reported unusual experiences related to the former Thorne property. These reports typically involved sounds heard from the direction of the empty lot, particularly during the winter months when snow covered the ground where the farmhouse had once stood. The sounds were consistently described as rhythmic hammering, similar to the sounds that neighbors had reported during Margaret's final months at the property. However, investigation of these reports never revealed any source for the sounds, leading authorities to dismiss them as products of suggestion and imagination. The persistence of these reports over several years suggested either remarkable consistency in psychological suggestion or the presence of some unknown source for the sounds that defied official investigation. More substantive were the reports of documents and personal items that continued to be discovered in the area surrounding the former property for several years after the demolition. These items appeared to have been buried or hidden in the woods that bordered the farmhouse, suggesting that Margaret's evidence gathering had extended beyond the house itself. Each discovery was investigated by local authorities, though the items were typically too damaged by weather and time to provide useful information. However, their existence suggested that a complete understanding of Margaret's activities would require a more extensive investigation than had ever been attempted. The scattered nature of these discoveries indicated either hasty concealment or a systematic plan to ensure that evidence would continue to surface over an extended period. The academic community's interest in the Thorne case was complicated by the destruction of physical evidence and the official reluctance to provide access to remaining documentation. Several researchers attempted to conduct independent investigations based on Margaret's maps and notes, though their efforts were hampered by the lack of official cooperation and the advanced age of potential witnesses. The few published papers that resulted from these efforts typically focused on the case as an example of institutional failure rather than attempting to solve the underlying mystery of Robert's activities or Margaret's fate. These academic treatments of the case emphasized the missed opportunities for justice and the importance of preserving evidence even when immediate investigation was not possible. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the Thorne case was its influence on law enforcement procedures for handling evidence of widespread criminal activity. Margaret's systematic documentation demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence even when immediate action was not possible, and her methods were eventually incorporated into training programs for investigators dealing with complex cases involving multiple jurisdictions. However, this influence was not acknowledged officially until the 1980s, nearly 50 years after the events that inspired it. The delay in recognizing the value of Margaret's investigative methods reflected broader institutional resistance to acknowledging that untrained individuals could contribute meaningfully to criminal investigations. The community of Millfield County gradually recovered from the disruption caused by the Thorne case, though the memory of Margaret's determined investigation continued to influence local attitudes toward isolated properties and absent neighbors. Residents became more attentive to signs of distress or unusual activity, particularly during winter months when isolation could become dangerous. This heightened awareness may have contributed to the prevention of similar tragedies, though no systematic study was ever conducted to confirm this possibility. The informal network of observation and communication that developed in response to the Thorne case represented a form of community self-protection that persisted for decades after the original events. Today, the former site of the Thorne farmhouse is marked only by an unusually level clearing in the otherwise dense woodland that covers Hickory Ridge Road. Local maps no longer show the property boundaries that once defined the Thorne family's isolated existence, and few current residents of Millfield County are aware of the events that occurred there in 1933. However, the County Historical Society maintains a small collection of materials related to the case, though these materials are not publicly displayed due to ongoing concerns about privacy and sensitivity. The Historical Society's files include copies of Margaret's maps and selected journal entries, though access to these materials requires special permission that is rarely granted to outside researchers. The question of whether Margaret Thorne ultimately achieved her goal of ensuring that the truth about her husband's activities would be preserved remains a matter of interpretation. While her evidence was discovered and documented, the lack of follow-up investigation meant that potential victims were never contacted, and Robert was never held accountable for his actions. However, her methodical approach to gathering and preserving evidence demonstrated a level of courage and determination that transformed her from victim to investigator, ensuring that her voice would eventually be heard, even if justice was never achieved. The preservation of her work through careful concealment represented a victory of individual determination over institutional indifference, though the practical value of that victory remained limited by official reluctance to act on her discoveries. In the end, Margaret Thorne's story serves as a reminder that truth can be preserved even in the most isolated and dangerous circumstances, though the preservation of truth does not guarantee the achievement of justice. Her decision to document rather than flee, to investigate rather than remain ignorant, and to prepare for confrontation rather than accept victimization created a record that outlasted both her own disappearance and the official desire to forget. Whether that record represents victory or merely the preservation of tragedy may depend on the perspective of each individual who encounters her story. The courage required to maintain such an investigation under constant threat of discovery speaks to human capacity for resistance even in circumstances that seem designed to eliminate all possibility of effective action. The woods that now cover the former Thorne property continue to grow undisturbed, slowly erasing the last physical traces of a family that once struggled with secrets too terrible to share but too important to forget. Yet somewhere in those woods, other evidence may still wait to be discovered by future generations who might possess the tools and determination necessary to complete the investigation that Margaret Thorne began in 1933. Until then, her story remains a testament to the power of individual courage in the face of institutional indifference, and a reminder that some truths, once preserved, can never truly be buried. The silence that has settled over Hickory Ridge Road may represent peace, or it may represent the continuation of concealment that began when Margaret Thorne first picked up her pen to document the unthinkable reality of her situation. The final mystery of Margaret Thorne's story may be not what happened to her after the confrontation with Robert, but what she intended to happen. Her careful preservation of evidence, her systematic documentation of Robert's activities, and her elaborate psychological manipulation of their final encounter all suggest a woman who is working toward a specific goal that extended beyond simple survival or escape. Whether that goal was justice, revenge, or some form of resolution that combined elements of both may never be known. What remains certain is that Margaret Thorne's determination to hold on to truth in circumstances designed to eliminate it created a legacy that continues to resonate decades after her disappearance. A reminder that individual courage can preserve light even in the deepest darkness.